about the various pollination types, the contrivances, the advantages and disadvantages. Today, we will learn about the pollinating agents and fertilization in flowering plants. The agents of pollination may be categorized as abiotic and biotic agents. The abiotic agents are wind and water. The biotic agents are insects, ants, elephants, birds, snails, to name a few. Entomophily is pollinating by insects. Entomo means insects and phyle means affinity. The flowers are large. If small, they are in clusters and are usually dull colored. Mostly, they are bright colored, scented, nectar producing. The nectar lies in nectaries at the base of petals or pistil. These features attract the insects towards the flower. The pollen grains are sticky or spiny and heavy to fix onto the insect body. The stigma is sticky, often inserted in the flower. Examples of such flowers are dahlia, sunflower, poppy, cosmos, lotus and lily. Let us see how pollination occurs in sweet pea. Sweet pea is zygomorphic with a large standard petal, 2 wings and 2 keels. The stamens are diadelphous with 9+1 arrangement. The bumblebee and the pea flower show symbiotic relationship. The bee lands on the standard petal and pushes its proboscis into the base of the petal in search of nectar. This causes the anthers lying on the filaments to come forward and deposit their pollen on the bee's back. Just watch how it occurs. Look at the anthers, how they are touching the back of the bee to deposit their pollen. The bee then flies to another flower and the stigma of the new flower then picks up the pollen of the last flower that the bee had visited. Thus, cross-pollination via the bumblebee as an agent is made successful. The word anemo means wind and phyle means affinity. The flowers are small, dull-colored, non-scented, nectarless. The stamens are long and hang out of the flower to be exposed to the wind. The anthers are large and loosely attached to the filament. That is, they are versatile. The pollen is produced in very large numbers. They are light, dry, smooth, winged or dusty to be easily carried by the wind. The stigma are feathery and hang out of the flower to trap the pollen grains carried by the wind. Examples of anemophilous flowers are coconut palm, date palm, grasses, wheat and maize. Let us now see a demonstration of pollination in maize. Note the staminate flowers with versatile anthers and the pistillate flowers with a feathery tuft of stigma to hold the pollen grains blowing in the wind. The maize plant is monoecious with staminate flowers on top and pistillate flowers below. Being protandrous, the chances of self-pollination is much reduced. The wind blows away the pollen in the loosely attached anther to be carried far and wide. The pollen are then captured by the feathery stigma of the flower, which have a large surface for the purpose, and thus pollination is made successful. We now differentiate between insect-pollinated, that is entomophilous flowers, and wind-pollinated, that is anemophilous flowers, on the basis of pollinating agent, whether it is insects or wind, the size of the flowers, whether it is large or small, petals, whether they are colored or colorless, stamens, whether they are short or long, stigma, whether small or feathery, number of pollen produced, whether few or numerous, nectar glands being present or absent, and of course, a few more examples to be noted. Hydrophily is pollination by water. The flowers are small and inconspicuous. They are odorless and nectarless. The flower parts are unwettable. The pollen grains are light, mucilage coated and produced in large numbers. The stigma are long, sticky and unwettable. Flowers have either their pollen or the male flowers floating on or just below the surface of water. Examples are Vallisneria, Zostera, Hydrilla and Ceratophyllum. We now will see how pollination occurs in Vallisneria, also called eel grass, which is dioecious. The male flowers are released from the plant to the surface of the water such that they float till they meet the female flower. The female flower traps the pollen by coming up to the surface of the water with the help of its elongated, contractile, thin pedicel. It then again goes down below the water. Ornithophily is pollination by birds that are small in size and have long beaks. The flowers are bright colored. The floral parts are leathery. Though they are not scented, they have abundant watery nectar. Examples of such flowers are Bignonia and Canna. Elephophily is pollination affected by elephants. It occurs in Rafflesia, which is the largest occurring flower. It is saprophytic with a rotten smell and is found at ground level. The pollen grains of one flower get attached to the feet of elephants when trampled upon, to be carried to the stigma of another flower when trampled by those same feet. Artificial pollination occurs when humans intervene with the natural pollination process. This technique is used for the purpose of hybridization to get better yield with desired variety. The desired female parent is pollinated with the pollen from the desired male parent. Precautions are taken to prevent pollination with undesired pollen. The technique is simple in unisexual flower. Two main steps are involved in bisexual flower, that is emasculation and bagging. A bisexual flower is taken and the stamens removed, the process being called emasculation. This flower is then bagged. Pollen is collected from another flower of desired variety and brushed onto the stigma of the emasculated flower. Then again bagging is done. Fertilization in flowering plants. Fertilization is the process of fusion of male and female gametes to give rise to an embryo. The gametes are specialized cells which serve to function the process of reproduction. The smaller haploid male gametes fuse with the larger haploid female gamete to form a zygote. The zygote is the diploid single-celled structure formed from the fusion of male and female gametes. The zygote develops into embryo, which further develops into an entire organism. The ovule in the ovary has two protective coverings called the integuments, leaving a small opening called the micropyle for the entry of pollen tube. Enclosed by the integuments is the nucellus, which is a mass of food-laden cells. The embryo sac lies within the nucellus and has 7 cells. During pollination, the pollen grain comes to lie on the stigma. The pollen grain has 2 layers. The exine, which is made up of a tough substance called sporopollenin. The inner layer is thin, made of alpha cellulose. At places where exine is thin, germ pores are present, from where arises pollen tube. The pollen grain has 2 cells, the large tube cell and a small generative cell. The pollen tube arises from the tube cell carrying the tube nucleus. The embryo sac has 3 cells towards the chalaza called antipodal cells. The pollen nuclei in the middle remain floating in the large central cell. There are 3 cells towards the micropyle. The middle larger cell is called the egg cell and the flanking smaller cells are called synergids. The egg cell and the synergids form the egg apparatus. A pollen tube emerges through the germ pore. The haploid generative cell divides to form 2 male gametes. The tube nucleus at the tip of the pollen tube, carrying the 2 male gametes, directs it towards the micropyle. Pollen tube enters the embryo sac through the degenerating synergid or between egg cell and synergid. The first male gamete fuses with the egg to form a diploid zygote, which develops into an embryo. The second male gamete fuses with the 2 pollen nuclei to form a triploid endosperm nucleus, which later forms the endosperm cell. The fusion of the 3 nuclei is called triple fusion. The endosperm is the nutritive tissue which nourishes the developing embryo. Let us recall what triple fusion is. Triple fusion is the fusion of 3 nuclei involving the second male gamete and the 2 polar nuclei, resulting in the formation of the endosperm nucleus, which later forms the nutritive tissue called endosperm to nourish the developing embryo. The process of fusion of the sperm nucleus with the egg cell and the second sperm nucleus with the 2 polar nuclei is called double fertilization. Now let us look at the post-fertilization changes. The ovary develops into the fruit. The ovary wall forms the pericarp or the fruit wall. The ovule lying within the ovary forms the seed. The placenta forms the seed stalk. The outer integument forms the testa, the inner integument forms the tegmen. seed coats. The nucellus tissue surrounding the embryo sac forms the perisperm. The egg cell fuses with the male gamete to form the zygote, which later forms the embryo, which ultimately gives rise to an entire organism. The secondary nucleus develops into the endosperm, which keeps nourishing the developing embryo. The synergids, antipodal cells, will get disorganized. The calyx may fall off or may remain persistent, as we find in tomatoes, brinjals, ladies' fingers. Whereas the remaining floral parts, that is the petals, the stamens, the style and the stigma, fall off. So thus we have had an understanding